Teachers of Reddit, what's the worst fight you had to break up? The worst fight I broke up wasn't because of students getting hurt, but because of how lame it was. First off, I teach middle school, which is just one awkward moment after another. These two kids were arguing over a pencil because one kid supposedly broke the other kid's pencil. They were bickering back and forth like two old men, and then they just broke out in really mediocre wrestling. It was embarrassing to watch because neither boy could even wrestle, and I was able to just tell them to stop and send them to the office with no other issues. Another reason it was the lamest fight ever was because all the other students who were working at other tables went about their work and talking to each other and didn't even notice. Usually they would be chanting fight over and over and crowding around trying to film for World Star. I remember a fight of two guys on a bouncy castle, around 12-14 age, don't remember. I mean, it's a bouncy castle. They were just sorta rolling around a bit, and from a distance it just looked kinda gay, like they were making out or something. I taught adults at a vocational school, mostly from rough neighborhoods. We had been warned to never try to break up a fight, as many of these students carried knives and so forth. Some woman had a bad falling out with her group of friends, and was sitting separated from them, but they were talking back and forth, very loudly, very aggressively across the room. I couldn't control them, and went to get a supervisor. With me and a supervisor guy there, one of the girls from the group came across the room at the odd one out. She is big, 6 feet and 250 pounds, and charges across the room at the odd one out, who is maybe 5 feet 2 inches. Supervisor gets in between them. They fight around him for a second. Then smaller woman slashes the face of bigger woman with a razor or something. That pretty much ended it, other than a few thrown things and tussle. But a lot of hair and braids were ripped out and there was blood everywhere. Supervisor was lucky. They literally fought around him, and the smaller one whipped that blade over his right shoulder to slash the other one's face. This was on a Tuesday, and they were to effectively graduate on Thursday. Insane. I am an English teacher in France. This happened in the classroom next door to mine, and I just witnessed the aftermath and heard the gossips from my friend who did break it up and was there to hear the story when they got hauled into the admin's office. One of my male students was named Timothy, who was dating a girl named Anna a year under him. One day last year he apparently left his phone unattended and unlocked, and she picked it up and started searching through it. What Anna found was his very male best friend Louis sexting and sending him nudes and talking about how much he loved him, and Tim was texting back and being equally enthusiastic about the two of them being together out in the open once they finished school and were in university. She proceeded to screenshot and send all those texts, sexts and nudes to her boyfriend's parents, before replacing his phone so he wouldn't know. Tim's parents are very conservative, and when I say very, I mean very. His mother once called me to complain about his grade in English, and it evolved into a rant about foreign students that would make Marine Le Pen proud. And Anna knew, so that's why she went this revenge route. This kid went home to be blindsided thanks to her, and apparently he had to basically flee the house because he was afraid of his father literally killing him. Louis turned up to school the next day, calmly entered Anna's first period class and beat the ever-loving crap out of her. Just wailed on her. He was skinny thing but knew what he was doing, and she was super tiny, and it was not a fair fight at all, and he just obliterated her. I just heard him screaming after he had been restrained, which is when I went to go check. She had a black eye and a broken eye socket, and there was blood everywhere from her mouth and nose. Louis was borderline hysterical and screaming about her being a bee who ruined Tim's life. It was bad. I am not a teacher, but I have worked in K-12 IT for 10 years, so I have been in a lot of classrooms. Teachers aren't supposed to break up fights and usually get hurt trying to do so. That being said, the worst fight I saw was in a science lab. I was in the back of the lab installing some software to go with a digital microscope, and a large 8th grade girl was singing disrespectfully while the teacher was talking. Tiny 8th grade girl behind her was getting pee and telling her to shut up because she couldn't hear what the teacher was saying. Big girl continued to sing. Tiny girl says for the last time, "Shut the frick up, I'm trying to learn," then proceeds to leap over the lab table between them, grabs the big girl's hair and proceeds to bash her face into the table over and over again, screaming at her to shut the frick up. They had to get a very large male administrator in there to pull her off. The teacher got elbowed in the face when she tried to step in, said screw it and ran out into the hall to get an admin. Fun times. Holy crap, I can just imagine that. My dad is a 5 feet 6 inches Hispanic dude, gentlest person you can imagine. His first teaching job was at a rough high school. Two guys, both much bigger than him, got into it, but security was nowhere to be found, so he tackled them both in a bear hug, so all they could do was stare at each other and rage while my dad waited for reinforcements. Literally dad power. Hug attack was effective. Enemies disabled. Substitute teacher here. I was randomly assigned for the very last period of the day to a difficult class. All of these kids were enormous. Like, maybe they were football kids? All I know is my petite self wasn't even shoulder level with these kids. So in a classroom full of enormous dudes, a few in the back kept picking on one kid in the front. The seriously huge kid stood up and charged at the super big kids in the back, who all stood up, ready to fight. My super lame reaction was to slam my tiny hands on the desk and yell, "Excuse me, back in your seats please." They all just sort of stopped and looked confused, and then sat back down. No fight, no problem. Nobody was more surprised than me. I ended up leaving them some good notes for their teacher because honestly, any enormous guys who stop their big butt fight just because some tiny lady in a cardigan asks them to sit down, well, they can't be all bad. I taught English to adults older than me and they got salty for the tiniest freaking reasons. It never evolved to be a physical fight, but holy crap, I'd rather teach children. They can be way more mature. I used to teach high school in rural Georgia. I had to break up a fight between two girls and a heavily pregnant girl. I never taught these girls and it happened between classes in the hallway in front of my room. The pregnant girl was on the floor screaming and crying while one girl was kicking her in the head and one kicking her in the stomach. I grabbed each of them by their upper arms and hauled them away very hard. One fell back on her butt and the other nearly fell. The one on her butt started crying about how I'd hurt her. The other girl acted like she was going to rush me or the pregnant girl. I grabbed her, held her back, and told her that if she tried it again I'd make her wish she hadn't. She tried to hit me, and I twisted her arm until she was on the floor kneeling and screaming. Meanwhile, one of the other teachers helped the pregnant girl and another called the nurse principal. I was the only one to act for a good 30-40 seconds. I had a student who fought a few times in my class, and was one of those blind rage type fighters who would just swing at anyone until he got back under control. He was manageable in my class, but he was sent to homeschooling after a fight he got into in the hallways. Something stupid set him off, and he punched the other kid a few times before being restrained by one of the security guards, who he also punched in the face. During the same fight, a teacher was trying to separate the two students, and he, accidentally, but still, broke two of her fingers. It dawned on me that day why they tell us to not get between students fighting. She was lucky that one, she wasn't hurt worse, and 2, that she wasn't written up on disciplinary charges for breaking that rule. I've only broken up a few fights, and they were pretty mundane, but if there is one thing I know is that girls' fights are worse than boys. Girls will go for your eyes, but boys typically stick to an honor code, no hits below the belt and all that. To add to that, most guys I've seen fight tend to walk away from it with respect for each other. Girls tend to drag that grudge to the grave. I had two girls fighting in my classroom. It turned into a hair pulling contest and my skeleton, Dr. Kelsey, Ian, life drawing class, wore one of their weaves for the rest of the school year. I like that skeleton's name. Not a teacher, but in my low-income urban public school we had an actual riot, with students punching police officers, tripping the fire alarm, damaging property, and screaming obscenities. School was cancelled for 2 days as teachers reviewed security footage and suspended kids. Of course, it was a doozy to break up a lot of dissatisfied kids in the cities. I'm not a teacher, but my high school put a jukebox in our cafeteria one year and for $1 you could play 3 songs. So these 3 girls put in like $5 and played 50 cents in the club on repeat. After the 4th or so repeat of the same song, some girl had had enough and went to unplug the jukebox. The 3 girls literally jumped her right there, punches and hair flying everywhere. I'll give the one girl credit, she was holding her own against the 3 of them. This is all going on and that freaking song was still playing. Everybody's watching them kick the crap out of each other. After about a minute in, some guy strolls over all casual like and unplugs the jukebox. They stopped fighting after that and that song was never played again. The end. Would be real funny if all 4 pounds on the guy for interfering. Actual teacher here. It was after school and I was headed to the copy room. On the way is the cafeteria, which had been cleared of all the tables and was basically just one big empty area, except for the huge mass of students that had developed. I rushed into the massive crowd where 2 different circles had formed. It was literally like being at a metal concert with 2 mosh pits. At least 16 kids were fighting. When I broke through, one kid fell in front of me and the guy who pushed him ran up and did a Yannikovsky kick to his head. All metal moshing instincts kicked in where my main goal was to basically push away as many people as possible and keep them away from each other until more AP's officers could arrive to help. It was chaos, so I don't remember much after that. To this day I don't even know why they were fighting. Once everything was settled, I picked my paper back up and went back to making copies. If you just change a few nouns, this could be a scene in a western. I taught for 2 years in a very rough boys' school where I had to break up fights almost daily. I'll share 3 stories. The first fight was when 2 students started fighting because of, well, I can't quite remember to be honest. It probably started as an argument over which one's mother is a bigger W, or maybe who owed who drug money. The fighters were grade 9 aged. It took 4 staff members to break the 2 apart, and even more to keep them separated after the initial blows. At the height of the chaos, both were throwing chairs, tables, and whatever else they could get their hands on. The end result was damaged windows, broken doors, and quite a few staff members that had cuts, scrapes, bruises from trying to keep the 2 away from each other. I'm pretty sure they met up outside school to settle their differences later that week. The second story is a bit more lighthearted. In my first few months of teaching at the school, I rewarded a group for good behavior by taking them to play soccer on their small hardcourt area. When I say good behavior, I mean they hadn't assaulted or verbally abused each other in my class all week. Even though I was still new, I felt like I could trust them since they had been relatively well behaved, and they were a small group. In the middle of the game, which was going great by the way, 2 players from opposite teams had a moment of frustration and started swinging haymakers. They both got a few good shots in, and by the time I was able to get in between them the fight was over. We took a 5-minute break, they shook hands and we continued the game. I didn't write them up for that one. The last story is one of the few times where I legitimately thought I would have to defend myself. I was on duty at the hardcourt during break, and I challenged a student on his behavior. He had been picking on a younger student, and all I had asked for him to do was stop. When he kept doing it, I approached and told him that he had to leave the hardcourt area. Once I was within 5 meters or so, he turned on me. He started telling me to frick off, and cursing at me with every word in his vocabulary. Everything seemed to slow down at this point as he started to walk towards me, with what I could feel was an intent to hurt. At the same time though, I could sense the other students watching, and starting to move closer towards us. I began stepping back while talking to him, trying to de-escalate the situation, and I even outstretched my arm towards him to try to keep space between us. Before the student was able to fully reach me, he was turned and escorted away by 3 other students. As crappy of a situation as that was, to me that incident had a silver lining. Even though at times I'm sure they all had their differences with me, that day I felt lucky to have those boys as my students. I'm not sure what would have happened if they hadn't stepped in, but I do know it would not have been a positive outcome. I began stepping back while talking to him, trying to de-escalate the situation. Hold your ground with both bears and teenage boys. I'm a school bus driver. My first year driving I got the bad school. Kids living in houses with boarded up windows kind of neighbor I picks up in. But I was the only ride these kids had and I loved them. A few small fights in the afternoon but nothing really bad all year till mid-June. I pull up to my first stop and there's Tommy on top of his sister Jane. Tommy was in grade 1. Jane in grade 2. Their older brother Billy was yelling at them. I saw this from afar. I sped up, slammed on the brakes, AMD flew out of my bus without thinking. Ripped Tommy off of Jane. He still had the wire in his hand. He was trying to kill her. Now, being in the neighborhood I was in, I couldn't send him home. So I threw him on the bus. Not really, and made him sit up front with all other kids at least 3 rows away. Took him into the school. I held his hand and his sister's, and we walked into the principal's office. The principal seemed like he didn't care, and I didn't see Tommy the rest of the year. No one told me what happened. That was over 5 years ago. We lost the run to another company, so I don't know how he's doing. Just a quick note, Jane could breathe. No marks on her neck and she was okay physically. Clear airway and all. Older brother Billy said it happened as I turned around the corner. I still think if I had a cell radio I would've called 911. Whoa. This could have ended way worse if you hadn't been there. You did great in de-escalating the situation and taking care of the kiddos. When I was teaching high school in Baltimore, I was walking down the hall during my plan time when I heard the sounds of fighting in a classroom. I poked my head in and saw Sam, this big, sweet kid who I taught, with another kid pinned to the floor, flat laying on top of him, hands pinned, etc. Sam is so big that this other kid is totally immobilized. Sam isn't doing anything to him. I think I can talk Sam into letting the kid go. I didn't know the other kid, so I bend down next to him and talk to him for a minute. I finally convince him to sit up. As soon as he starts to push back, the other kid gets his arm free and swipes at Sam with a knife none of us knew he was holding, except Sam. Sam had special needs, and I'm not sure if he just didn't think to tell us about the knife, or if he was trying not to snitch. Narrowly missed my face neck, and Sam had him pinned back to the ground before any further attempts could be made. We let him stay that way until the police arrived. I don't get involved in fights anymore. Not a teacher but saw the craziest fight when I was in high school. There was girl, I'll call her girl A, who was mentally challenged. Rumors were she was a preemie born addicted to drugs, crappy home life, in foster care, just all around crappy situation for her. She was about 4 minutes and 10 seconds in high school. Just a really little person. Well, this one girl B, thought she was the prime target to bully, and, well, she picked the fricking wrong person to bully. B messes with A for a few weeks until the day A snaps. Here's the thing, in our high school we had the gates that drop down to close off corridors. You just hit the emergency release and the gates slam down and there's no leaving that corridor until the on-campus police officer comes to unlock it with a key. Never had these gates been used until B messed with A for the last time. Remember, A is mentally challenged and special needs. B is messing with A and all of a sudden A runs for the emergency release button for these gates to drop. Gates drop, it's A and B and a few bystanders stuck in the corridor. A beats the ever-loving crap out of B. Remember how the on-campus police officer has to unlock the gate with a key? Yeah, well that took a solid 5-6 minutes to go get the key and get back to the corridor. And by this time there's students on each end of the corridor pressed against the gates to watch the butt kicking that's happening. B ended up going to the hospital and never came back to school. Rumor was she was in alternative school for all the bullying and A ended up in a state psych ward. I had to tackle a 6th grade boy that had a 5th grade girl by her hair on her knees, pounding her face in with brass knuckles. He broke her face in several places and knocked out most of her front teeth because he had asked her out and she said she was too young to date. The kid fought me like crazy while I had him pinned, kicking, pushing us across the grass so that my face is digging a trough into the field, trying to bite me, spitting on me, all while I'm thinking, I just bum rushed and tackled a student. I'm going to get fired. I laid on top of him until the cops got there. They investigated what happened and I wasn't in any trouble because the general consensus was that he could have killed her and I went with the least violent way to subdue him and I didn't injure him. The 5th grade girl spent some time in the hospital and had to have some mild facial reconstruction surgery. The boy went to juvenile hall. That's horrible. I bet that girl got some pretty bad emotional scars from that one. My first year teaching, I had to break up a bunch of typical middle school fights: hair pulling, fighting over boys, weak punches when boys were involved. 7th grade, we had a bit of a gang problem, so it was fairly common. 2 still really stand out to me though. The first involved 2 girls fighting over a boy who had been sent to juvie. I walked out of a classroom where I was observing. and one was already being held back by our 7-foot-tall social studies teacher. The other girl was ripping fistfuls of the other girl's hair out and screaming, "He's my man. Get the frick out of my hall." Other girl who had her hair ripped out was an 8th grader, and 8th graders were supposed to stay out of the 7th grade hall. The screaming one was a student of mine, so I just walked in, asked her calmly to let go or be picked up, and picked her up to take her to the office while she screamed and clawed at me. At one point, she promised to calm down, and I fell for it. She immediately ran back and began fighting again, so I had to carry her to the office. Later, they asked if I wanted to press charges for the kicking and scratching. I literally laughed in the deputy's face. How vindictive are people that they have to ask if you want to ruin a 12-year-old's life. There was one even worse than that, though. I had one student who was a gang leader in my class, but he was always respectful with me and worked hard in class, so I just sort of chalked it up to rumors. One day near the end of the year, I turned around to write something on the board, and heard a girl scream. I turn around and the quiet, respectful kid had ripped one of my loud mouths out of his seat and was kicking him with precision directly in the kidneys while bellowing, "Think you gonna jump one of my boys, frick you." I was horrified. This kid was a weightlifter, and prying him off of the other kid who was curled up in the fetal position was nearly impossible. Once I did get him off, I screamed at the other kid to get the next door teacher. Being the antagonizing bud that he was, he stood there and called the kid from the gang a P. The kid from the gang escaped and chased the other kid around the school, throwing furniture at the instigator and screaming. It took me 5 minutes of chasing them through the halls while the other teacher watched my classroom to get admin or the deputy to help. It was then that I decided not to teach middle school anymore. I teach high school now and see my old 7th graders a lot, including fighters. One even apologized to me. Most of them want me to teach them when they reach the grade I teach. I just really hope they have chilled out with time. Obligatory, not a teacher, but my high school has had some fights. Here's a few stories. 1. One day, a small, skinny kid incited a fight with an extremely large, 300 pounds of pure muscle kid after picking on him all day. So, after a single punch is thrown, the giant picks up the small one, puts him over his head, and then smashes him down into the ground, face first. There was blood everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, and especially on the kid's face. 2. As the entire school exited a pep rally, a fight between two girls breaks out in the middle of a large crowd of students. Weaves flew. It took several teachers to finally stop the fight. Also, a security guard decided it would be a great idea to use pepper spray on said fighters, despite literally the entire school was all crowded around in this small area. As expected, several students were hit with minor injuries, but one teacher got a direct hit to the face. 300 pounds kid was a young Thanos. Young, female high school teacher here. Worst fight I've broken up. A 250 pound kid pushed a 90 pound girl from behind, sending her skidding about 8 feet down the hallway on her stomach. She jumped up and shoulder checked him into the lockers and just started beating the crap out of this guy. Punch after punch right into his face. I walked up behind her, grabbed her around the waist, and lifted her off of him as she continued to punch him. As I walked them to the office, she looked at me and said, "I don't even freaking know who this guy is." Worst fight, I refused to step in and break up. The two largest, toughest guys in our school got into it in the hallway right in front of my classroom. These were the kind of boys that were already pretty much grown men and each had around 100 pounds of muscle on me. I heard yelling in the hallway and turned around just in time to witness one punch the other square in the teeth. He hit him so hard that I swear I could feel the vibrations in the air. Like, I felt the punch, it was so hard. And oh my god, the sound of it. They then started punching at each other as they rolled around the ground in a huge pile of blood that had come from the one's mouth after the first punch. I would have gotten hurt breaking it up. I internally said frick that and called the office to tell them to send out police resource officer and admins down there ASAP to break up the fight of the decade. There really is a unique and scary sound to hearing two people hitting each other, much more so when they're big. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.